Good afternoon, and since I'm the chair, I would just like to open up this discussion with a couple of questions to both the speakers. In which order would you like to go?
Nitya first, then
Okay. Nitya, and Nitya has just informed me she'll be focusing on access to justice, right? And Vrinda has informed me that she'll be focusing on issues of impunity, and after which I'll make a few concluding comments on the overall situation in the last 1 year. So may I request you to focus on what are the critical issues on access to justice that have arisen either negatively or positively in the last 1 year, and I request you to just focus your attention on 1 year, like from today backwards. So please.
Thank you, Indira. Justice really means access to justice. That is its meaning. Now, whether law enables this or does a law hinder this? Does social environment aid this access to justice or does it retard it? If we cast our mind over the last year, one thing immediately comes to mind. You see, say from 2003 in particular, many things. There was this incredible phenomenon of extremely high-ranking officers in Gujarat, all wanted for the elimination, for the murder of ordinary citizens, a 19-year-old girl, people from low middle-class background, and such a rich crop of high-ranking officers were wanted for these acts. It's entirely through the efforts of activists and lawyers like Vrinda, who's sitting here, and others, who moved heaven and earth to get this bunch of officers within the framework of the criminal justice system. They were brought within the framework of the law. What we have seen in the last year is that almost every one of them has not only escaped the clutches of this process, but is actually back in high places. The point is not whether what has been halted is a resolution of their guilt or innocence. So this is a process, that is, the legal justice, criminal justice process has been hindered by this. There is talk of the introduction of a law like Gujkoka. Of course, many hurdles have to be overcome before, if it at all becomes the law. This is in spite of repeated studies as well as judicial concern over laws of this kind, but there is talk of introduction of a law like this. Coinciding with this is an executive maneuver to control judicial appointments. Now, I'm not going into the vexed legality of this step, which is before the Supreme Court. All that I'm saying is that there is a politics to this maneuver, which has not been sufficiently spoken about at a time like this. Alongside these efforts with the law itself or the legal process, we have seen a spurt of a certain kind of activity in society, a particular class of social lawlessness, attacks on churches, a suggestion that they should, in Chhattisgarh, that they should not be parsons but pracharaks. And even as people have been trying to catch their breath to deal with this, in the heart of the capital, Muslim signboards are getting blacked out. Now, where does the momentum for this kind of social lawlessness, a spurt in this kind of social lawlessness, Hartosh and the rest of it, come? It comes from a perception that the usual access to justice, which might be possible, has been effectively blocked either by law or by policy. Now in governance, one may agree with some steps, somebody else may disagree with some other steps. So I'm not suggesting that a particular law or a particular policy is really the only way to go about it. But when it comes to social justice, law is a norm which can be used either by the victims of injustice or by interlocutors on their behalf as an aid to access justice for them. And the abolition of child labor is exactly one such law. Vasudha Dhagamwad, the great crusader in this behalf, once told me, when I asked her, I said, there are people who say that why don't you recognize the child laborer? Why do you want to obliterate him? Because then you do not, he doesn't figure anywhere and he can get no benefits. And she said, this is the biggest balderdash that I have ever heard. Because unless you abolish child labor fully, you cannot get a child out of the factory into the school. And now there is talk of diluting this law. I am given to understand that there are about 60 amendments suggested by the PMO for easing the norms on environmental clearance. And I'm also told that the Forest Rights Act its rigors are going to be diluted. So it is in this combination of law and policy which seems to go somewhat against the grain as far as access to social justice. Forget about social justice, it is absolute ideal, but even access to social justice, means of access to social justice. That you have a spurt, as I said, of activities against identities happening. I want to end by saying something else, which is that our response to this must be well crafted both in deed and in word. Because if we introspect, some of our own postures in the last years may have mirrored at least the discourse of the oppressors. But since this is neither the time nor the place to go into that, I will just end with a mention of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitya. You ended well before your time. I was hoping you would continue for another 5 minutes. But thank you for drawing attention to the fact that law and policy are inseparable. I think that's one of the points that you made, that one can't think of law without policy and policy without law. Both are equally true. And I also think that you drew attention not just to the letter of the law, but the intent of the law. You can have
the
a law.
working of the law.
Exactly. You can have a law which is kind of facially neutral, but one has to go beyond that and look at the intent of the law. So now if we could have Vrinda, please take your full 15 minutes.
Sure. Yes. I'll carry forward some of the issues that have been flagged by Nitya and what is the impact that all of this is having around us. I want to focus on the issue of impunity. And I do want to say here that impunity was not invented last year in this country by the Modi Sarkar, but that impunity today has been legitimized. It has received sanction, not only from a form of social sanction, partially which already existed, but also it's getting a lot of political sanction, and it is getting entrenched. And that is where the danger lies, that will the institutions that are meant to then challenge and contest this impunity, would they be able to rise to the occasion? That is the apprehension that then arises in the minds of an ordinary citizen. Nitya mentioned about the extrajudicial killings called the encounter killings of Gujarat. Yesterday, marking 1 year as Prime Minister Modi in China, while addressing an Indian audience, said that 1 year ago, on this day, May 16, 2014, everybody in the country said, Dukh bhare din bite re, which is an old Hindi song, Hindi film song. I think it's important to ask, for whom are those days of grief and sorrow over, and for whom do they persist, and for whom have they got aggravated? Because surely Indian citizenry is not a monolith that we are engaging with. So if we were to ask Shamima Kausar, the mother of Ishrat Jahan, or we were to ask Javed Sheikh, the father of Gopinath Pillai, or we were to ask Narmada Bai, the mother of Tulsiram Prajapati, what is the answer that we will get? Why, with the change of a political regime, do court cases either change direction or come to a grinding halt, when the Indian Constitution and everybody else goes around telling us that there is independence of the judiciary? Today, insofar as the Ishrat case is concerned, which I am well versed with, the charge sheets have been filed, the trial has not commenced for over a year. I don't even hear anybody asking the question why. Nobody in the media has any curiosity about this aspect. One reason why the trial is not proceeding is because the Home Ministry is sitting on files which are required to give sanction to prosecute IB officers for being part of a conspiracy of cold-blooded murder. As was mentioned earlier, all the police officers, barring the one who's retired, have been reinstated. Not only have they been reinstated in high positions, in fact, one of them, while being reinstated, has been made in charge of an inquiry that has been instituted against the investigating officer of this very case. What is the signal going down to the entire police force? And I think that is what we obviously need to read. It's not just about what is going to be written out on the paper. The signal to the police force, and it's not confined to the jurisdiction or borders of Gujarat, is one, you should dance to the tune of the political master, and sooner or later you will be protected. Two, killing in cold blood is condoned and allowed, and then even if courts will question you, there will be ways in which you will be protected and shielded, and political power will interfere. These trials do not stand much of an opportunity to actually be able to either reach a conclusion or even give any sense of justice, because those who have been reinstated are supervising officers today of those who are going to be witnesses in this case. And it doesn't take too much to understand what is going to happen in that. The other, and I think it's important to understand that this is not going to stop in the state of Gujarat and is not peculiar to Gujarat. And we know that the Gujarat model is now to be replicated for the nation. The Supreme Court, the media, everybody, and quite correctly in my view, castigated the CBI for being a caged parrot. Today, nobody is asking the CBI what is happening in these matters, and CBI is the prosecuting agency. The CBI has failed to file a single go and appeal against orders of discharge, including against, in another set of encounters, against the present president of the BJP. Nobody is asking why is the CBI not doing what it is expected to do. So why, we need to ask, what is this kind of selective rage that is expressed? Let's try and understand that what does this do? It's not about these few cases. What to my mind is actually at play is to alter the terms of engagement between a citizen and a state. We know that the Constitution was brought in and overlaid upon a deeply hierarchical social economic system. It's been 60 years of struggle to try and get some semblance of recognition for a citizen as a rights holder, get legislation which at least allude to some kinds of rights. They are far from being appropriate and far from having any meaning insofar as directive principles are concerned, but there is a beginning being made there. Today, what is sought to be altered is to alter the relationship between the citizen and the state, as well as reinforce the hierarchy of citizenship which exists, but which law and constitution and policy is meant to try and surpass and create some form of level playing field for citizens. Whether around class or caste and religion, The hierarchies of citizenship are being created over and over again. And this is happening both, as Nitya said, from the signals that are going out, and the signals are going from the political leadership. When silence is maintained, or when others are encouraged to perform certain acts which do alarm, which do create fear, which do create apprehension in the minds of those who do belong to these vulnerable and marginalized communities. The Prime Minister recently visited the state of Chhattisgarh to inaugurate power plants and others. State of Chhattisgarh continues to have the largest number of Adivasi under trials in jails for 2 years running by the NCRB data. What is the role of good governance in that? Why is it that these are not issues that are being addressed or even being engaged with? And we know the answers. The answers lie in actually putting them away while a certain form of economic policy and growth is pushed, which is creating today a clear hierarchy of citizenship in this country. On the issue of women and gender, all political parties, including the Modi government, it's become actually a very interesting talking point and a rhetoric point where you can flag that issue and say that, how you stand by it. But what does anybody do after that when your own political party and other leaders in parliament sent out repeatedly a deeply sexist and misogynist signal to all of society, and on the ground you don't see any change being advocated, either structurally or otherwise. The only change that is brought about, and which actually is something that there is a thrust towards, not only of creating hierarchies and oppression, but a thrust towards creating an aggressive militaristic approach towards everything. So whether it is the amendment to the Juvenile Justice Bill, which passed through Lok Sabha and is now pending in the Rajya Sabha, it will come up in the Rajya Sabha in the next session, which seeks to put juveniles between 16 to 18 who have allegedly committed heinous crimes into the adult prison system and the adult criminal system in the name of women, in the name of ensuring that women get protection. The whole argument that violence has a direct link and you can diminish violence only by creating situations of equality and freedom seem to be negated at each count, and between the death penalty and the juvenile going into the adult prison is the only approach that is being advocated. And my last point would be that in this process, the people who are standing in the way of this, which are the activists, which are the political dissidents, they are today being labeled as traitors, as anti-nationals, and there is a fury that is being created socially against them. And there is a change which I think is way more dangerous than an amendment or a repeal to a law, where a change of sensibility is taking place, where you are made to believe that what is being said by the political leadership is correct, and it is not for us to question and definitely not for us to challenge. When your vocabulary is being affected, when the use of the words like secularism and human rights leads to an uproar, leads to you being attacked, then we have made what to my mind are not tremors, but a tectonic shift, and this is just the first year of it.
Thank you, Vrinda. Okay, so having heard both the previous speakers, what I'm going to try and do is to synthesize some of the comments they've made and put it within the framework of law and justice, which is the subject of the discussion this afternoon. So the first point to begin with is really the timeline. You mentioned that one cannot understand what's happening unless one goes back almost to when India became independent and what has happened in the last 60 years or 65 years, leaving aside the 1 year that we are going to isolate and talk about. So we all know the kind of progressive movements that have taken place during this period. And the question before us is going to be, where are the turning points in these in this period? We know that the first turning point came in sometime in 1991 when this country decided to aggressively become part of the global economic agenda framework, to withdraw from social sector, to privatize. That's definitely one turning point. Now, but I think that simultaneously with that turning point, realizing that this kind of turning point could completely jettison marginalized peoples, corrective steps were taken, particularly in the last 10 years, and thanks mainly to a vibrant civil society. Now, I would say these corrective steps were in the nature of bringing laws like Narega, bringing in laws like, well, governance laws, like wanting a whistleblower law, like other laws which would have strengthened the democratic fabric of the country and gone a long way in protecting the marginalized. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no contradiction really between capitalism and protecting the interests of the marginalized. And that, I think, is what was happening in the last 10 years. Their rights of the marginalized were being protected in recognition of the fact that they cannot be just discarded. Now, why is this? The reason for this is because a constitutional document by its very nature attempts to bring together under one umbrella different constituent elements. That is the whole purpose of having a written constitution. And that is why I think in the last 60 years, definitely we had a kind of a constitutional arrangement, a constitutional compact, which tried to bring together the interest of varied segments of society, although at times their interests might have differed from each other. Now, that brings me to the 1 year in question, and I'm going to try and identify exactly what changes have occurred in this 1 year. Well, first and foremost, let me focus on the constitutional framework. In my opinion, I have seen a kind of a constitutional coup, and it reminds me of something that Ambedkar said while drafting the constitution itself. And he said that, it's all very well for us to draft this constitutional document, but he said, I'm also aware of the fact that the written word of the constitution can be subverted. And the whole question is, how do we prevent the written word of the constitution from being subverted without changing the language of the constitution? So, in my opinion, in the last 1 year, this has been the whole exercise. How do you change the constitution while maintaining its form? And in my opinion, this has happened in several ways, which I will try and outline. The first thing I think which I've noticed is the obliterating of the difference between party and government. I think there's been a collapse between the two, whereas in law and in the constitution, these are two separate entities. The second thing is there's also a collapse between government and state. Again, these are two separate concepts in law, but there's a kind of collapse between the two in the last 1 year. There's also been a kind of mockery of the cabinet system of government, what we call collective responsibility, to parliament. A word about that I will say later. There's also been the manipulation of the principle of federalism to suit a particular economic agenda. There has been an attempt to give primacy to the position of the Prime Minister, again something that's not visualized by the Constitution. Two very other important, there has been an attempt to bypass Parliament through the institution of ordinances. You just don't need a debate, you can just pass an ordinance. There has been an attempt to collapse the separation of powers, what we call the classical separation of powers between the executive, the elected parliament and the judiciary, and more particularly between the executive and the judiciary, where today we have institutional frameworks in which the head of the executive and the head of the judiciary will be sitting at the same table and selecting so-called eminent members, and they will also be selecting the judges who come in the future. So this, I think, is what I would like to characterize of the changes that I have seen in the last 1 year. Now, add to this, and finally, something that Vrinda mentioned, and that is the battle of perception. There is definitely a feeling in my mind that we are not just fighting a real battle, but we are also fighting a battle of perception. Now, how is this battle of perception posed in front of us? There's been a concerted effort to portray the interests that we and other activists represent as being quote-unquote sectarian. Now, there may be sectorial interests, but as I said earlier, they have to be all brought under the umbrella of the Constitution, but this is not being recognized. There's also been an attempt to portray activists or civil society organizations as those who have entered into a conspiracy with foreign funders. And the purpose of this conspiracy is to destabilize what they call the second phase of reform, namely to fulfill the election promise that the Prime Minister in waiting made. That was that at any cost, we will achieve a 10% GDP every year for the next 4 years, which brings him bang in time for the next election. So if that is the agenda of the ruling party, then obviously we are coming in the way of that so-called, we are being portrayed as anti-growth, anti-development. And this, I think, is one of the battles that we are fighting. So it's not enough for us to rest content with fighting constitutional battles. We need to go a step further and also fight the battle of perception. And this battle of perception is being played out in social media, in mass media, in instant opinion polls. As I said, they're portraying us as anti-growth. They're using the IB to come up with a figure which puts a figure on the amount of loss caused to the government of India as a result of our activism. This I consider to be policing of thought, and is one of the battles that I think that we are going to also have to raise. And finally, are there any ways in which resistance has been offered in the last 1 year? That it's also important to identify where resistance is going to come from. From my observation, I find that there's been no resistance on the issue of Ministry of HRD. Ministry of HRD has done a lot to undermine the Constitution from within by appointing people loyal to the RSS, etc., as vice chancellors, etc. I have not seen any resistance on that front, and I could be wrong, but I have not seen it. The IT ministry, I'm sure, floated the whole issue of net neutrality with TRIA, again in an effort to, close the net, but we did see strong resistance in that direction. I have seen resistance from sections of the judiciary. The resistance has come in many different ways. Either they have struck down unconstitutional acts of the present government, or they are currently appear to be resisting the attack on the independence of the judiciary. That, I think, is, I hope, is some kind of a wrap-up of what both of you have said. So thank you to both of you.
Thank you.